to the panel discussion portion of today's Family Business Conference. And what I would like to do is introduce the panelists that we have from local family businesses and obviously from different sectors. I'm going to follow that with asking each of our panelists to give a little background on their company and perhaps how they've been evolving over the past few years and under their leadership. And then I'm going to be asking them some questions similar to what I did to Mr. Cherry, but leave a sufficient amount of time for you to ask questions of the panelists. You can throw those questions out. I will be repeating your question once you've asked it because we are taping today, and so I need to repeat the question so it'll be on the film. So I'll start with our first panelist to my left, your right, and that's Liz Freeman. Liz is the president of Long's Personnel Services. And, of course, she's a third-generation owner of her family's staffing and recruiting firm. She holds a BS degree in Human and Organizational Development from Vanderbilt University, and she's been employed with Long's since 1998. She currently serves as president of the company, as I said, and she's responsible for all aspects of the business. Judd Freeman, her husband, he also has ownership in the company, and he works for Long's as well, managing HR and risk and safety. So somebody's bound to ask a question about what's that like?
We're still married.
Yeah, right, and strong, right? Near and dear to my heart, immediate past chair of the Mobile Area Chamber of Commerce. We worked her like a dog last year, and she continues to be so involved in our chamber. So thank you, Liz. Next, we have Brent Barkin, and Brent is the president and CEO of Shoe Station, which you're all certainly familiar with. That company has grown to, he told me this morning, 21 stores. So we look forward to hearing a little bit more about that tremendous growth throughout the region. He started his work right after he graduated from Princeton University. He has held several roles at the company, assistant buyer. He was director of e-commerce, vice president, executive vice president, chief operating officer, and then now, of course, president and CEO. He attended Yale University, where he received his BA in public policy. Next, we have Mike Lee, who is president and CEO and owner of Page & Jones. Page & Jones is an international logistics company, which is headquartered here in Mobile, but they have 12 offices in 6 states. I'll let our panelists, of course, describe a little bit more about their company, so we'll hear a little bit more about what Page & Jones does in just a moment. But it was founded in 1892, and this year they're celebrating their 126th year, so congratulations on that. Mike, we certainly think you'll be hanging around, it looks like. I think that's going to work out.
Another century or so?
He is also past chairman of the Mobile Area Chamber of Commerce, and we appreciate that as well. Mike has children involved in the company, and 2 of his grandsons are now working summer jobs at Page & Jones, representing the 5th generation of the family in the business. He earned his finance degree back in the early years of the university, in the 1800s, right, at the University of Valley. And he's going to maybe give us a roll tide. Anecdotally, I'll tell you that our final panelist, Ty Bullard, his dad, I think Mike gets confused with him sometimes. People think that you're Joe Bullard, don't they? Y'all look a lot alike. So you might have if things get slow, Mike can tell a story or two about when they've been mixed up, right, Mike? So I will end with Ty Bullard, who's president. I will end with Ty Bullard, who's president at Bullard Automotive Group. He attended the University of Mississippi and graduated there with a BA degree in business management in 2006. And he immediately began his career at Bullard, which is now a 3rd-generation family-owned business. He became the dealer principal in 2013, which includes multiple car franchises for the company. So if you would, join me in thanking and welcoming our panel of local business leaders. So, Liz, let's start with you. If you could give us some background on Long's and perhaps what's been happening since you've taken over.
Absolutely. Glad to. Good morning, everyone. I can't see everybody over there, but I'll keep trying to peek around the podium. So, of course, this family business, Long's Personnel, Long's Human Resource Services, was founded in 1948 by my grandfather. He was actually a revenuer during Prohibition, and his brother, one of his 11 brothers, was a bootlegger. So that was an interesting relationship there. And about 18 years after my grandparents, Myrtle and William Long, were married, they had my wonderful mother, Sarah Damson. So when that occurred, my grandfather decided that he needed to get out of that dangerous industry and left short of retirement, which my grandmother always reminded us, and came down to Mobile and decided that he would start a personnel agency. So he was quite an entrepreneur at the time and took a big risk. And at that time, of course, you would pay to have someone find a job for you. So that was an interesting situation where you had someone who's been employed trying to collect a fee from them when they finally got to work. But that business evolved, and shortly after my father came back from Vietnam, he went into the business, and he and my mother worked alongside my grandparents. And my grandfather died suddenly, so my father was thrown into the role as president, and my mother was still, actively involved with the business, and she really stretched herself out and worked in the community and had a big community presence. So that has always really been at the heart of our business, is to take care of our community first. Everything we do affects the people in our community, so that's really important in our culture. And so my father and my mother grew the business, and we had those rules that, after 5, no more shop talk, because it could get a little tense around the dinner table. So we still try to adhere to that, although sometimes it just creeps up and you can't help it. So when I graduated from college, I actually didn't know what I was going to do. And my father, being in the employment business, basically told me I needed to get my act together and figure out something. So I decided to come and work for our computer training school, and did some sales and computer training, and then my father encouraged me, which I thought was extremely wise, to develop some skill sets outside of what our family business did, which was actually in IT. So I developed some IT skill sets, and then that morphed into managing IT for our company, and then into operations, and then on up from there. I guess I've actively been running the business for about 3 years now, so there's been quite a bit of change, and I'll share some pretty personal stuff later on as we get into it, but that's kind of where we are right now.
Great
and
overview.
My husband's still working with us. So.
And you're still married?
Yeah, still married.
Great overview, Liz. Thank you. Brent, I will ask you to go next.
I apologize for my voice. We have a new pet pig, and my wife and I were chasing it around, disagreeing on how to corral the pig. So we'll leave all of that for Q&A. I'm Brent Barkin, President and CEO of Shoe Station. My father founded Shoe Station, and the reason for its name, in an old tire and battery store that's right by Bel Air Mall in 1984. So my siblings and I, right at the beginning, 4 brothers, also 1 sister, and giving away balloons and popcorn at the grand opening, like right next to gas pumps. A little different now. So we have now 21 stores, 5 states, and my father's philosophy was always measured growth. So it was, if you're not growing, you're dying, but he also didn't believe in skyrocketing growth. So his thought process was always to take your gains, roll them back into the company. And Pensacola, Biloxi, Tallahassee, Baton Rouge, and just to expand from Mobile. And it wasn't for a while where he realized we could actually have a second store in Mobile. So that kind of took, and that was store 15, that took the store to an entire new level of growth. But I came back, and we started on the website in 2004, 2005. That's led to another layer of growth. But as all family businesses, I now have siblings who I was working at age 10. Some of them were working at varying ages and didn't necessarily like it. All of a sudden, they like it a lot more, right? So that's kind of a new set of challenges. They like the idea of working for us now. Happy to take any questions, but happy to be here. Thank you.
And Brent, your last 2 stores, where are they?
Last 2 stores, we purchased a 2-store chain out of Columbus, Georgia. That's one of our last 2 stores, and Tuscaloosa, we just reopened.
Okay, thank you. Mike?
Well, the first thing I wanted to say is that we have, it just hit me as we got up here, but we have some employees we've gotten through Long's personnel. I'm probably on my 25 years of Joe Bullard cars. And these shoes came from Shoe Station. So I can't help but be thrilled with all these family businesses up here. This is great. Page and Jones for us, for my family, the Lee family, and now my daughter and son-in-law, the Krause family, actually came into Page and Jones right at the end of World War II. As you heard Bill say, Page and Jones was started in 1892 when the original Mr. Jones had been sort of an executive assistant for a very famous Andrew Mellon in New York, who was one of the big financiers and was even eventually Secretary of Treasury. Mr. Jones moved back after the late 1880s, moved back to Mobile and started a shipping company. Somewhere around World War I, Mr. Mellon actually also owned ships, and he gave them those ships to handle in Mobile, and they operated ships and their own ships for the War Shipping Board during World War I. My dad and uncle came back, had both worked on the waterfront. They had both been, I think my grandfather, my dad, all my uncles, everybody had been in the longshore unions working in Port of Mobile. And when they came back from World War II, my dad and my uncle went to work for Mr. Jones, along with a nephew of the original Mr. Jones. And not long after that, around 1949-50, Mr. Jones passed away, and the two of them and the second Mr. Jones bought the business from the original estate. So my family has been involved, I guess, since 1949. My dad worked in the business until he was 82 years old. It was interesting listening to these transitions. I mean, he was there until 10 days before he died. So far I don't have a good retirement plan. I have nobody. I've got no direction on that whatsoever. But it was interesting in our family. The first generation, my grandfather was a checker, longshore checker on the docks, and when his 2 sons bought into Page and Jones, they hired him to run the dock operation. So the first generation actually came to work for the second generation. And then I came along after college in Alabama. I worked all through high school, college, summers and vacations, and learned enough about the business to decide I wanted to be involved. And except for college and I think 7 or 8 months in the National Guard, I've been here the whole time. So my whole career has been here. A lot of people have commented, said, you must really love the business. I said, I really don't know how to do anything else. So this has been a career. But it's been great. It's been great to have my son and my son-in-law both working in the business in different parts of the business. We are ship agents representing ship owners who bring things into the port. We handle ships like today. The Carnival Cruise Line ship is in town, and we have people working there with the ship and the crew and its needs. My son-in-law works and heads up our logistics group over the custom brokerage freight forwarding, where we handle the documentation and clearance and freight items for importers and exporters. We do a lot of the automotive industry, and we have people working on with Airbus here. But any type of international transportation is included in Page & Jones services. And as Bill said, we started here in Mobile. Since the mid-'70s, we've expanded into 12 other cities. Our expansion actually slowed down because the rules changed with customs. You used to have an office anywhere you were doing work. Now we have what's called a national permit, and we, on any given day, are doing entries in Los Angeles or clearing cargo in Miami or New York or any place. So we really haven't had to expand location-wise as much, and we've been able to build the size of our organization here in Mobile.
Thank you, Mike. Ty?
I'm Ty Bullard, and our company started, really my grandfather, who was actually from Mississippi, moved to Mobile back in the 40s and started a little filling station right here down on St. Louis Street. And then back when service stations actually were service stations. And so somehow from the service station he started selling used cars and eventually acquired the Oldsmobile franchise in 1955. We opened downtown, and then we moved to what the point of town called 5 Points. And most people probably remember our company, especially back then, as Joe Bullard Olds. And that's really all we were for 40 years. Back then, that's all you needed to be, because there wasn't near the competition than nowadays. And General Motors had a pretty big market share back then. So my grandfather started in 55, and then my dad and his brother-in-law, actually, his brother-in-law was in the business before then, but my dad had played football at Tulane, and then he actually went to the NFL for a very short preseason, and eventually realized that they didn't really want him anymore, and so they decided he'd gotten cut from that, and Minnesota actually called, the Vikings called, and my mom stepped in. They were married at the time and said, no, we're not moving to Minnesota, and so he decided to come back and start selling cars with my grandfather in 1972, and so my dad moved back, got in the business in 72, and then his brother-in-law and he brought my grandfather out in 1980. Our expansion as a company didn't happen until about 1987, when a lot of these other manufacturers started moving into the country, and we started receiving open points and going after those. And so since then we've expanded, and we've grown and condensed over the years, and now we represent several manufacturers here in town, and we have one operation we've bought within the last year up north of town about 80 miles. So I came into business in 2006, right out of college, was married, moved right back to Mobile, and went into the business, and have not screwed it up yet. So there we are.
That's fantastic. Thank you. So as we get started with the questions, I'd like to start by asking you each, if you would, please, tell us some key areas where you have directed change in your respective companies as you've taken over the reins. So Liz, we'll start with you.
My father and I have very different management styles. This is hard to say because I don't want it to sound offensive. It's not. It's just different management styles. He was more... I don't know that he engaged other thought as much. I think he knew what he wanted. He had the vision, and he just pushed it down. So that was a little culture shift for us. And then he also had a tendency, we had an independent satellite office that was able just to run itself and never had any hands intervening. So that has been a big shift. For me, because I'm more, I'm in the mix. I sit in the middle of my staff, and so I'm there making phone calls and placing people as well. And also more hands-on with our satellite office. So I think that's definitely been different because I'm kind of right there in the trenches with the staff.
Mm-hmm. Let me add a question to that. How have you been able to shift that culture? Has it been a slow process?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
We've had a lot of turnover. Yeah. But my team right now I'm very proud of, and it's been very hard.
And I guess initially they were probably shocked when you were right
Yes.
there in the middle with
Well,
them.
and also there was a lot of resentment. I mean, we had some very long-term employees that probably, it was so interesting to hear that being passed over, that idea, because they were, and people that thought that, maybe they would have that leadership opportunity at some point. So it was very hard to get some buy-in for a while until I proved myself.
Brent?
I would say mine was on the marketing side. So the internet we pitched to my father having a website, and this is in 2004. Had started having the conversation in 2002, 2003, and he was completely against it, and you're not going to be able to sell shoes online. So, and this is right as Zappos, obviously, Amazon is coming into play. But in addition to the kind of pushing the website and getting that going, I think the other major push that I've had has been on the marketing side. And we were all newspapers and are still newspapers. But at that point, 90% of our customers were coming to us from the newspaper. And it's now still 70% of our budget, and it's about 30% of our customers. So that's been a tough transition for us. I'm sure Ty can talk about it too, but just in terms of just how you can't give up that core customer, but at the same time recognizing that that's not where I need to be a decade from now. I would say that's the biggest change that I've helped kind of push.
Absolutely. Mike.
I still come into the store, so. That's right. That's right. Yeah, core customer. Core customer. I think probably the most interesting time or the biggest change I saw when I came into the company, in the first 5 or 6 years I was there, it was a real dramatic shift worldwide as containerization came in. And in the earlier days of our company, and even when I first arrived, the ships were calling directly at each port and unloading what we call break bulk cargo. It's palletized, or it's bundles, or it's steel, but it was not in containers. And Mobile was very slow to get into containerization, even though it was designed and started here by Malcolm McLean. It's kind of ironic. We were 25 years later, getting really heavily into it like we are now. But when it first started to happen, the ships were all going to the East Coast or West Coast for what they call land bridge, and the cargo didn't pass through Mobile anymore. It went straight from Savannah or Charleston or Los Angeles or Oakland to, in some cases, Houston or New Orleans, but it would go straight to places like Huntsville and Birmingham and Jackson, Mississippi, and Atlanta. And so one of the first things we realized we had to do and not lose all that business was we opened an office first in Birmingham, then in Huntsville, then in Jackson, then Atlanta, New Orleans, because we had to serve those and grab those customers, the existing customers, at the place where customs required the work be done. And that turned out to be a great transition for us, because we not only survived the fall off in Mobile and along the Gulf Coast, we were able to establish ourselves in those new markets more out of necessity than out of any desire to just simply spread out. So that was a monumental change in the industry that we had to go through not long after I started in the business. And I was actually moving to places like Birmingham and Huntsville and living there for 3 months and getting the office started and hiring the staff, and then coming back to Mobile as soon as we could get that going. But that was a big point and turning point in our company.
Ty, changes that you've been implementing.
I think for us, for me personally and our company, it was really more of my dad at the time when we kind of passed the reins. Our company had kind of grown to a size where it wasn't a big company, but it had gotten to a little more corporate style. And I think it was really just because my dad had really taken back. He was really out of the day-to-day, and he had a team in place to really run the day-to-day. And I think that just naturally transitioned to more of a corporately style run company. And I think with that passing of the torch, it allowed me to kind of get us back into a family company. In a company that, the door's open, it's easy to get into. There's communication at all levels. And I think for us, that was probably the biggest change that's taken place. Now, I believe it was a good change, but that could go either way. I'm not saying there's a bunch of different business models and ways you can run your business. But I think for us, I think that's probably what it brought. It brought that back that we had kind of, I think, gotten away from a little bit in our company. So.
Related to the generational transitions that you've all experienced, share with us if there were other family members that perhaps were vying for the position, or maybe also share how you were ultimately chosen by the family business to do what you're doing. Liz?
Goodness. Well, I came home. My sister continued school, and then she went into pharmaceuticals and just really took a trajectory and did fantastic, and now I can't afford her. So it just, we were very blessed that we didn't have that concern, because we are so very close. My sister and I are best friends, and I know that would wreak havoc on our relationship if we had to share the business.
Interesting. Brent, were there other family members involved?
Not kind of when it really mattered. Now that it's a little further along, they like the idea of it now. But no, not ones that would have fought for the position.
For the position. Okay. Mike?
Well, it was a little unique for me. When I first got out of college and went to work, my dad and my uncle, the customs brokerage part of our business required 2 custom brokers licenses with Treasury. And just 2 years after I started working, my uncle passed away, so we only had 1 customs license, and I had a period of about 6 months where I had to qualify and pass the test. So my dad and I were the 2 qualifying officers. And also being an only child, I sort of got it by default. So between the lack of siblings, it was pretty well a path set there.
Yeah, and for my situation, it was not I wasn't necessarily vetted against somebody as far as that top spot. I have one older sister who now just had her 5th child and lives in Huntsville. She never had a desire to be in the business, as far as I know. And so for me, there was really no other person kind of vying for that role, as long as my father wanted to keep it in the family.
Right. Makes sense. What would you do differently, and you all don't have to answer this, but what would you do differently during the management transition if you could do it again?
I really wish I could have a redo. I always say that truly was one of the hardest times of my life, that transition. When with Leonard, when he spoke about ego, my father's ego, and those battles, it was a huge challenge. And
Probably very typical.
Yes, and when I finally, because I wanted to prove myself, and once I got there and had the security and the self-confidence, now I regret some of the things I said in those heated moments, and both of us, we were acting childish. So I would love a do-over.
Any other comments?
I wouldn't say it's so much what I would have done differently, but if I get into the situation now and we go into another generation, what I'll do, because I can't really. My dad was not the kind of person where we would have had those real deep, meaningful conversations about, well, if something happens to you, what are we going to do? Who do you want doing this? And I tried to have those conversations with him. I don't know if I could have forced those conversations, but if we go into a third generation, I'll be a lot clearer. Especially, I do have a brother who's on the board with me, so I don't want to diminish his role. But I'll be a lot clearer. And he and I had a good conversation just last week about, if something happened to me, who would do this? Who would be in charge of the merchandise? Who would be in charge of the operational side of the store? So I think that planning and being real clear on that planning, I wish he and I had the personality to have hashed those out. But if and when we go through it, I'll kind of take that lesson.
It's interesting you brought that up, because one of the things that I was most impressed with Leonard's experience was that they're doing this now. They're getting in a room, they're talking through it. And he said, 60 days ago it started. So they're going through a process, which, candidly, I don't think very many family businesses do that, because the family members don't feel comfortable asking the kind of questions that you're talking about. So great point. Mike?
Well, it might sound strange, but I would say that, I really can't think of anything we'd do differently, because my dad was particularly good, I think, about letting me find the way, and there are things I did wrong, but I think in every case it was a learning experience that has been valuable and was easier to handle at that time than it would be later. The mistakes could have been much bigger later than I was making at the beginning. And the fact that it gave you some chances to do that, and that you got a chance to learn from those, I really think maybe in the long run, the things, I wouldn't change those things we didn't do quite right, because I think they ended up with a long-term positive effect on us.
Yeah, as far as differently, I don't. I think one of first off, it's an extreme blessing to even be in this situation. But something that I personally struggled with during this process, that I think I put some false expectations. I think I had a lot of false expectations that I created that I put on I put on my father, which was totally not fair, wasn't right. But I also, the father-son relationship is an interesting dynamic in all of this, because the father looks at his son in one way, but the son also looks at his father in another way. And there's a certain line you don't cross, or at least from my opinion, I wasn't comfortable crossing. And I think having conversations about the dynamics between, hey, I'm your father, you're my son, and I'm your business partner, and you're my business partner, I think just more conversation about those differences, I think is healthy. It's tough conversations, and I told my dad the other day, I said, it is really hard for me to tell you this right now, just because you're my father, not because you're my business partner, it's because you're my dad. And just trying to push through and have those has been tough, it's been hard, but at the end of it, has been extremely healthy. And so I think just more of that.
May I add on to that? I know Brent and Mike, your fathers have passed. Liz and Ty, I mean, you still have your fathers. They're not in this room, though. So so I'm going to ask this question. Has it been difficult? I mean, are they having, or did they have trouble letting go? And then we'll just let y'all jump in on that if you would. You don't have to answer it if you don't want to, but
It's funny because I was going to jump in anyway
Okay,
and make
okay,
a comment
good,
about that. I wrote first staff meeting on my card. So, it's hard to have two chiefs, right? We all know that and you're in any transition, when an executive team is moving over or switching out. And we had two chiefs for a little while. And my very first staff meeting that I ran, where I sat at the head of the board table, my father came into the meeting. He didn't sit around the table with us. He sat in the corner in a chair and would just insert as the meeting was going on. And it was horrible. It was absolutely horrible. But, my fault for not being sensitive to that transition. So it works both ways. And now I see, when I have friends, when I'm talking to the father of the kids who are taking over, I see where my father was trying to grasp onto some relevance. And I was not sensitive to that. But it was a huge challenge.
But it's important because the team, the staff, I mean, they get confused.
Well, it is. It muddies the water, absolutely.
Yeah.
So you've got to have a clear line defined.
I've always
that's
said
really
it's biblical.
important.
You can't have two masters, right?
No,
I mean,
no.
And I think that does cause a lot of confusion. So I'm sure that's pretty typical, though, with the transition in a family business. Any other comments?
I think for us, my dad did an excellent job of getting out of the way. We'll just say getting out of the way. I think.
But he had, as you mentioned earlier, he had sort of withdrawn some.
He had, yes. He had done a good job of getting out the day-to-day way before I was involved. But I think it's because his father did it. When he signed that note and my grandfather walked out, he didn't come back. He was there if he needed him, but he just, for the people standpoint, for the operation, he left. And so I think my dad had seen that, and as we are, we're creatures of kind of what we see, and I think he wanted to make sure he did the same thing as far as the employees, and who the employees know is the decision maker. And so I really honor him and thank him for that, because it's been a critical piece for our success.
It's a great gift. As far as this generational transition, obviously a lot of generational businesses, they reach a point where they sell. My family business that I grew up in, they did that. Have you had conversations about that at any point? Like, do we go this direction or do we go a different direction as far as transition?
I can say in our case, we talk about it a lot because our industry has gone totally to mostly multinational, publicly traded companies. There's very few companies like us left. When I came into the business, it was all family businesses. There were 5 or 6 in Mobile. You could go to any big port in the country, and it was mostly individual, sole proprietorships. So we're kind of an oddity now. So we hear from the bigger guys almost constantly. So we're always talking about, is that a smart thing to do? Right now I have my son and my grandson, as I mentioned, have been in the business for quite a while now, and I have 6 grandsons. So we can keep it going if we decide to keep it going, and it'll be. I think it's important that we're always open, though, to look at opportunities where it might be better for the family, or if the family doesn't, not 100% sure the next generation, which would be my grandkids, would still want to do this. I mean, right now I was lucky my son and son-in-law wanted to be in the business, but we'll see if it translates to a 5th generation. They've worked there in the summer. We've had Generation 5 up there the last 2 summers, so try and just let them see and get interested as they get to that age. So we'll see what happens, but that'll be probably the big, in our company, that'll be the biggest challenge. I mentioned I was an only child. We've made the transition to a son and son-in-law, but what happens when there's 6? And some don't want to be in the business, some do want to be in the business. That's going to be the more interesting transition, I think.
I had interesting, listening to Mr. Cherry and his conversation about the kind of the separation between family and equity ownership versus family and salary. And I thought that was one of the smartest things my father did. Was he basically did a leverage buyout of the company where my siblings became equal partners with each other, and then he had the same majority voting stake. I think had that not been the situation, I think I'd have a lot of outside forces kind of suggesting that we make a change. Because of that and the fact that we're now giving dividends, all of a sudden it's a lot more palatable. And that's not to say that anybody's greedy. It's just if they see the fruits of the labors, right, then it makes sense. If it's this external entity that they are getting nothing from, but they have ownership in, but they have no decision-making authority and are getting no benefit from, it's a lot easier for them to push a sale. Mm-hmm. And we're in a really good place in that right now because they don't, because they see the value of it.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that Mr. Cherry also said was that his father required that they do something else before coming back to the business. I know that some of you have not done that. You've gone directly into the business, but would you want to do that for future generations? What are your thoughts on that? I thought that was an interesting point he brought up.
Yeah, and real quick, I mentioned it earlier when I was talking about how the company evolved, but my father, even though I came into the business, I came in on the IT side, and my father specifically said, you need something, a skill set that can take you elsewhere if something happens to the company. So that was, being in staffing, it makes sense that was his perspective, and I'm very grateful for that because I was able to acquire some skill sets that if this didn't quite work out, I could take another path.
Any other thoughts?
I would say the example I was using of grandkids, we have encouraged them to do other things and see other things. What has sort of happened with us and happened with the generation after me is when they started working there early, like I did. I think I was 15 when I started, developed an interest in the company, and they didn't want to go anywhere else. So, which is fine too. But I certainly think it's good to see an outside perspective. My son worked a couple other places early, right out of school, and saw that. But we didn't actually have any kind of requirement like that.
We didn't have a requirement, obviously. Wouldn't be here. But I certainly think it's healthy. Yeah, I think it's a great idea, just to give that person a perspective. Whether it's a short stint, but when there's got to be some great perspective for you to carry on into the family business when you've worked for somebody else. And I would, in certain circumstances, highly recommend changing that in the future.
And Brent, you did something else before.
Yeah, I'll have to adjust my bio. I was actually a school teacher, middle school teacher for a few years, so that helps you deal with some of your employees too.
That's fascinating.
It's not that far.
Yeah.
But no, I think it's healthy. I really do.
I appreciate that. So, and I'm sorry you have trouble with your mic. Sorry about that.
It's awful.
Liz, I mean, you were sharing something you do differently. But as I asked Leonard Cherry, maybe share with us some things that you do differently besides the transition of power. Anything else that you'd like to share that you feel like you would do differently if you could do the transition over?
I think my father's, and maybe it's a little similar to what you were saying, my father's management style was very top-down. And I wouldn't say heavy-handed, but just he would make a decision, that's the decision, there was no debate. I was a public policy major, so basically a politician is the mindset there. So I would come into it a lot more team-oriented, a lot more let's all make a decision, which is fine, but at some point you still need to make a decision. So I think there was a little more, not say tolerance on my part, but maybe a willingness to hear those points of view and not necessarily to stand down. I was going more for consensus, maybe than I should have been. It's good to get their input, but at the same time, people do value that leadership where you can get their input, but it doesn't have to be a team decision where we all go around and take a vote. We weren't that formal, but I think maybe just for that transitional period of those few years, maybe I should have been a little, I'm doing it more now, but maybe a little bit more clear about I was getting input, but not necessarily.
Understand.
Everybody didn't have to agree.
Yes. Anything else?
So you say not necessarily for the transition, or just?
Well, as you're changing the company, growing the company, anything that you would do differently,
Actually, I would have fired faster if I could do it. Yeah, I
Don't drag it
held
out.
on to some people for too long that affected culture. So.
Interesting. You've all had growth in different ways. Ty, y'all are all over the place. Mike, 12 states, 21 stores. Liz, you're over in Baldwin County. How do you manage the growth, or how has your family business managed that growth over the years? Has there been a strategy there, or has it just organically happened?
Other than blind luck, you're looking for. Yeah. I know in our case, the biggest challenge, the only reason, it doesn't take a lot of capital for us to open an office somewhere. We basically rent an office and buy a computer and get some communication access. The only thing that holds us back is personnel, finding the right person, because if you're going to stick a person in Dallas or Atlanta or Jackson, Mississippi, you cannot watch or control everything they do. You can't make sure they're doing everything exactly like you want it to do. So you have to find good quality person to do that. They have to be sort of a self-starter. And I think in our case, it's also further complicated by, depending on the U.S. Customs rules, to open an office, for instance, in Los Angeles, I have to have a licensed person. And there aren't that many out there. Most people don't even know what a custom broker's license is. So there's a limited field of people out there, and trying to find those people, and then that person also having the skills to run an office himself is probably the only reason we don't have twice as many offices as we do now. If we just knew, how to get the people, how to make that transition. That's the toughest transition for us is personnel.
Anybody else?
I'd say people. That's the same problem we have. Management doesn't seem that it would be as complicated and as consistent a need as it is. And if we had 20 ready managers, I don't know how. I know how much faster we could potentially grow. It's the single biggest limiting factor.
Anything else? Well, why don't we do this? Why don't we open questions from the audience at this point? So what questions do you have? Don't be shy.
And the hiring is a chore. Weeding through candidates. How much you're in that business, but all of you've got multi-employees. What is your screening process? How do you, obviously you get different levels. How do you weed through all of that?
So the question is about the hiring process and how you screen through those candidates to hire.
Well, I'll jump in. It's interesting because I've really now shy away more from skill set and hire more for innate drive, how someone's wired as a person, because I can train the skills. But if I know that that person, is ethical, that they're compliant, that they have drive, they're going to show up for work. I mean, just these basic things that you think would be included in every human that they're not. I can train the rest. But there are obviously industries and positions where you're not able to do that. But in certain positions where I can, I try really to get into that person and see how they're wired.
I would say the one thing that we have to fight, because I have general managers hiring for the most part their assistants and their hourly, is complacency. So you have a situation where you've got a staff that seem okay, but they're just okay. And you have some people that are fantastic, but you have of a 15 or 20 employees, and you ask the managers, well, how many of these could be assistant managers? And they say, well, none. And then you're going, So now if you lose an assistant manager, we have a crisis instead of an opportunity. And if you have people waiting in the wings, every open position is an opportunity instead of a crisis. So I think we're trying to encourage those managers to constantly be hiring, constantly be interviewing, constantly be hiring. And as hard as it is, luckily our budgets aren't as constrained. But if you have somebody that you've interviewed and you're not really sure where you're going to put them, find a place to put them, because you'll have somebody else leave, or somebody else will politely threaten you if you ask them to do too much work, or at the review you don't give them a high enough raise. And you have a lot better position of strength if you have people that are looking for their job, and we're getting better at that.
Our biggest challenges right now are the new security requirements. Being in the logistics business and working heavily with government agencies like U.S. Customs and TSA and all the rules on transportation, we have all kinds of customs regulations that, so we have to do the background checks, we have to do certain types of training, and every aspect of it now is so much more detailed. We have to, when we go into something new, when we started doing work here for Airbus, they sent 2 security people over from Toulouse, France, to spend 3 days with us looking at machinery, looking at people, wanting to see your records. They were so security conscious, from not just on the side with the government agencies, it's terrorism and security. It's intellectual property with the big companies now. So they want to see, and I mean, it's been an education to us. You hear the horror stories about how somebody hacks into your office through the Coke machine, and it's just crazy. But there's so much now that now goes into the hiring process too, and it's added a whole nother level of requirements and also finding people that understand that somebody cares about all this, so you can't be cavalier about it. And it's created another level of human resource things that I know Liz is seeing.
I think for us, one thing I didn't realize or have an appreciation for when I first started in our business is I thought we had to bring everybody from the outside, just because I just felt like, we were stagnant. I felt like we needed some outside voice, fresh eyes. And one thing I've grown to appreciate is from promotion from within. And so, something that we try to consistently do is any position open in our company, we're always internally promoting it. And we try not to miss one, because if you miss one, they think you're, and so not because, we've found the greatest employees, but just to give them an opportunity. Because I've had a lot of surprises where I said, I never would have thought to ask that guy if he wanted to do it. But, that skill set and everything makes a lot of sense. And so it really creates a certain culture in your company. But, I think we all hear a lot of people, in the hiring world of, we can't find good people. We just can't find quality people these days. I mean, I hear it all the time. And I say it some. But I think what I've tried to focus us on is let's be a place quality people want to work. And all of a sudden they'll start coming to you. And you kind of flip it. and it's really been interesting to see. It creates an always recruiting strategy, an always recruiting theme, and so I tell our people, you always got to be recruiting. You know, it's a question we ask every week. How many interviews you had this week? Well, I don't have any positions. That doesn't matter. How many interviews have you had this week? You know, you always got to be interviewing, and so in recruiting, and so that's a couple little things that have helped me.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
So the four of you guys have stepped into and inherited, bought into a family business from a father in this case, and you know, Mike, you shared having a son and a son-in-law and grandkids. Man, one of the things that you think about is, are they going to want to do this too? So my question to you all is, when did you know? You had opportunities to go elsewhere, to pursue other paths, and had that option even. When did you know what was that story like? What pushed you over the edge to take the leap?
So the question is, at what point did it dawn on the panelists that they wanted to do this? They were ready.
Well, I came home because I was in love, which I still am, and with my husband, who I'm married to. Just for clarification. And so when I got into the business, I mean, I'd always seen what my parents put into it. They would host these unbelievable open houses, and my mother would be in the kitchen cooking for it. And I mean, just such a sense of pride and such a sense of providing and taking care of the customer. And it made me really proud as a child. And it also made me proud to see both my parents working at something that supported all of us. So just naturally, I always had a sense of pride in what they did. And so it just evolved. I mean, when I came back and started working, I'm like, wow, maybe one day, you know, I could be there. Yeah, absolutely.
Brent?
Yeah, I got microphone, bad luck. Yeah, sure. There we go. No, I think mine started almost as a way to spend more time with my father because I was one of five. And I was the second child. My father would always say second in age, but not in importance. And he didn't mean I was first in importance. It was kind of a fun little, I got it. Other people are like, oh, that's so sweet. I'm like, no, that's not how he means it. But it was a way to just be around my father and interact with my father. And as the others didn't really either care about interacting with my father or, and they did, but not at work, or they had other interests. It was kind of a fun time to do that. And that, I mean, this is almost like a psychologist question. Thank you. But I think because of that, I grew to, and it was something he had interest in. So, I mean, you know, certain fathers share love of sports with their son. Ours was kind of a love of the business.
With me, I had worked, as I mentioned before, on the docks and around the office, just as odd jobs, runners. I even one time, for a very brief period before they grabbed me by the collar and moved me out, I worked the switchboard. Everybody lost all their calls, and we actually had an old-fashioned switchboard. But I got to see all the different parts of it. But when I went off to college, I went to the University of Alabama. I actually was enrolled in a pre-law and had just not thought about whether I would be there or not. But as the next few summers and part-times over the first couple years of college, I just really was fascinated by the business. I mean, I thought those massive ships coming in and out of the port and all the work that was associated with them was really interesting. And so I finally basically had to tell my dad no, and I really would like to come to work. And they said, great. But until then, he had not pushed at all. But I realized I would say maybe it was my sophomore year in college. I thought this is what I'd like to do.
I think for me, I always knew I would. Now, let me phrase that as I was hoping I'd have an opportunity. Let me put it that way. So, but I didn't want anybody to know that. I think for me, one of my challenges has always been is I've always put my dad on a pedestal. And I've always thought he was, you know, for a long period of my time, I always thought he was perfect. And so I think I just looked at that and I said, well, that's what I want to be, you know. And so I think through some of that, which those are issues and, you know, it's not the way you need to be, but I'm working through that. But I think I always deep down knew that that's what I wanted to do. And obviously once I got in the business, I think I realized that some of my skill sets really really transitioned well in that business, and I really kind of fell in love with it. But I think I always wanted to. I just didn't want to tell anybody. So.
Okay, we have time for one more question before I turn it back over to Dean Wood.
Yes. My question is about how your family dealt with having one sibling come into the business and other siblings that did not come in. We have several people in this room that have that issue where how did your family or your fathers, mothers treat the other children equally to deal with this, that you're in the business and they're not in the business?
That's a great question. Not easy to answer.
It would start to be a therapy session. Goodness, it's not an easy question. Fortunately, my sister has been incredibly successful in her career. So it's not she hasn't been very needy. She's not in a, where am I in this picture? She's had opportunity for ownership and currently doesn't have ownership. So my parents have done a really good job in keeping our relationship balanced, I believe.
I think in our case, as I mentioned, it was, I was an only child, so I didn't have a sibling to deal with. When you went to the next generation, where my son, and I mentioned my son-in-law is there, my daughter worked a few summers at Page & Jones, same kind of thing I did, and she really just had no interest there. She wanted to go to, became a speech pathologist. She's currently the dean of the lower school at St. Paul's. And that was what she liked, and she was quick to tell me she had no desire to get into the shipping business. But because her husband is in the business with us, and their family is participating that way, there's really no opportunity for any friction there. I mean, and basically both siblings are in the business, and it really worked out well because she also is getting to do what she wants to do.
I think for us, my dad was always wanting to be real fair, which is the right way to be. And so, the way he had 3 older sisters, he was the baby boy. And so when my grandfather handled him similarly the way he handled, I have 1 older sister, like I said earlier. And when you look at our company, we have a couple companies within a company. And the companies that are not operational, it's 50-50. Between my sister and I is the way it's set up. It's the fair way to be, and there's no reason I should get any more than her just because I didn't contribute or contribute to that. My dad is from operationally. It's the person that's the operator. That's the way he believes. The operator needs to have full. The person putting in the work is who should realize the operations. And so he's been real clear on that with my non-participating partner, as I call my sister, non-participating partner. And so it's been great for us. There's no, I say that there may be some underlying things, but I think at this point it's been healthy. It's been real clear. It's laid out. It's all written out. It's all on a plan. And for us, that's kind of how it's worked out. So it's been fair when it needs, when it's based on contributions, I guess is the best way to say that.
That's great. Well, we want to thank y'all for sharing with us and spending this time with us. Liz, Brent, Mike, Todd, thank y'all so much. And if you'll join me in thanking our